If you had a competition to rank the stupidest things that humanity has ever done, a strong contender for the winner would have to be World War I. For me, few events in history are as depressing as the outbreak of World War I. That's not only for the war's insane body count, but also for the sheer pointlessness of it. Sometimes you just have to wonder, what on earth were they all fighting for? In 1914, Europe had been relatively peaceful for a century and was the absolute centre of the world. It was the richest and most prosperous place on earth, driving innovation and inventing astonishing new technologies. Then, for no reason at all, Europe decided that it was going to tear itself apart. It decided to destroy what it had spent so long creating. While the outbreak of the war was tragic, it was also many other things. It was complicated, unlikely, and frankly, weird. How does an act of terrorism by a Serbian nationalist in Bosnia end up with Germany invading poor old Belgium? Many of Europe's leaders were desperate to prevent war and devastated when they failed. For instance, when the German ambassador handed Germany's declaration of war to Russia, he then burst into tears. The British Prime Minister also cried on the eve of war. The extremely strange sequence of events that led to World War I has occupied historians since before the war was even over. Also, the subject of fierce debate is who exactly was to blame, and it's that question that I want to address in this video. It goes without saying that it's not possible to say anything definitive on the question. Historians that have spent years studying it disagree. What we can do is to recount some of the main actions of the various nations before the war, and to try to judge whether they were, on balance, escalatory or de-escalatory. However, before we can begin that, we need an extremely brief overview of the events leading up to World War I, what would come to be known as the July Crisis. In June of 1914, Europe was at peace and war didn't seem to be on the horizon. There were, of course, tensions between various countries. Particularly strong were those between Austria and Serbia, who had conflicting claims over land in the Balkans. Serbia had a strong nationalist movement that wanted to see a bigger, grander Serbia that included all the ethnic Serbs from the region. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was now very weak and, frankly, barely holding itself together. Many people thought it might break apart at any minute, and should that happen, Serbia wanted to be in a position to take as much territory as possible. Serbia was particularly hacked off about something that Austria had done 6 years earlier. Austria had been administering the territory of Bosnia, which was, on paper, part of the incredibly weak Ottoman Empire. In 1908, the world was stunned when Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia, incorporating it into their empire. Serbia was incensed by that, and some Serbian nationalists even called for war. Tensions persisted, but Europe just about held itself together. Then came the assassination. On the 28th of June 1914 in Bosnia, a Serbian nationalist assassinated the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. That was absolutely huge. Perhaps a modern-day equivalent would be something like 9/11. Austria was of course outraged by the assassination of their heir, but they weren't sure how to respond. Should they go to war with Serbia? If not, what should they do? Germany was allied with Austria and promised to back it, whatever it chose to do. Meanwhile, Russia was allied with Serbia and promised to defend Serbia should Austria go to war. Eventually, Austria decided that it would send Serbia an ultimatum. Serbia must either accept various humiliating demands or Austria would invade. On the 23rd of July, almost 4 weeks after the assassination, the ultimatum was sent. The Serbians agreed to some but not all of the terms, and so 5 days later Austria declared war. The next day it began shelling the Serbian capital. At the same time, Russia, fearing attack from both Austria and Germany, had been readying its military. That process, known as mobilization, was hugely provocative to Germany. Fearing Russian attack, Germany issued its own ultimatum, demanding that Russia stop mobilizing. Russia refused, and so Germany declared war. With Russia and Germany at war, another great power was drawn into the conflict, France. France was allied with Russia, and so it also had to declare war on Germany. With Germany threatened on both sides, it decided to attack France, hoping for a quick victory that would allow it to divert its military towards Russia. Attacking France required going through neutral Belgium, and that provoked Britain. After German troops advanced into Belgium, Britain declared war. So that then is a whistle-stop tour through the events leading up to World War I. Now we can look at what each country contributed to that astonishing escalation, from a local contained conflict to the most horrific war the world had ever seen. We'll start with Serbia. Serbia's main culpability for World War I is of course for its role in the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. Trying to work out exactly how much the Serbian state was involved in the assassination is extremely difficult. It's almost certainly not the case that the Serbian Prime Minister himself ordered the assassination. However, some members of the Serbian state, particularly the military, were involved. Given that everything was done in secret, determining exactly who knew what about the assassination plot is impossible. The assassination was carried out with the help of a movement known as Black Hand, and the Serbian state did have ties to Black Hand. Also known as Unification or Death, the movement was formed to unite all the territories with ethnic Slav populations into one nation. Much like Germany and Italy had recently been unified into single states, Black Hand hoped to do something similar with the southern Slavs, to create something similar to Yugoslavia. One of the biggest barriers to that project was the Austrian Empire, hence why tensions were so high. The relationship between Black Hand and the Serbian state was very complex and opaque. The Serbian military did have high-ranking officials that were heavily involved in Black Hand and likely involved in the assassination. Black Hand was actually involved in bringing the king to power 11 years earlier and still had significant control over the royal family. For instance, one member of Black Hand was the tutor to the Serbian prince. Given that the Serbian military was particularly tied to Black Hand, it's likely that the weapons used in the assassination came from the Serbian military. Because of that complex and opaque relationship between Black Hand and the assassination, it was and still is difficult to judge whether the assassination should be considered an act of state aggression or not. Needless to say, the assassination of the Austrian heir was extremely inflammatory to Austria, given that they knew Serbia's hands weren't entirely clean. The Serbian government itself did offer the usual formal response, extending sympathy for the assassination. However, the Serbian public was elated, even euphoric, and there were public displays of celebration. The Serbian press also fanned the flames, praising the assassins and accusing the Austrians of lying. The most inflammatory and insulting Serbian headlines were then reported by the Austrian press and of course caused huge anger. The Serbian Prime Minister himself also said various inflammatory things. The day after the assassination, he said that if Austria exploited the assassination, Serbia wouldn't hesitate to defend itself. Perhaps even more inflammatory than that was Serbia's failure to fully investigate the assassination. Many people from various different nations agreed that a thorough investigation should happen, from the Times of London to King Carol of Romania. In the end, that wasn't the case. The Serbian authorities never carried out an investigation appropriate to the importance of the assassination. An investigation was started, and a week later it was closed, with the finding that the assassins had nothing to do with Serbia. For Austria, this was essentially just a slap in the face. Potentially, the Serbians were so reluctant to do the investigation precisely because it would have shown links to the Serbian elite. Of course, what eventually happened is that Austria sent Serbia the ultimatum, which then raises the question of how Serbia's response should be judged. There is debate about exactly how conciliatory the Serbian response was. Some historians view it as giving Austria almost everything that they wanted. Others view it as largely a rejection of Austrian demands. In the words of historian Christopher Clark, it was a highly perfumed rejection on most points. Various people at the time did view the Serbian response as conciliatory. The British Foreign Secretary said that Serbia had given satisfaction to a degree that he never would have believed possible. Emperor Wilhelm famously said, "Any reason for war has now been eliminated." Overall, the Serbs were clearly open to war, at least with Austria. At the same time as they gave their response to the ultimatum, they ordered a general mobilization of their military. Serbian openness to war is clear based on what was being said at the end of July, when war was just about to happen. The Serbian ambassador in Russia was actually excited to deliver the news that Russia was mobilizing 1.7 million men. He said, "In my opinion, this presents to us a splendid opportunity to use this event wisely and achieve the full unification of the Serbs. It is desirable, therefore, that Austria-Hungary should attack us." Overall, Serbia's actions were extremely inflammatory and made it very difficult for Austria not to respond militarily. That then brings us on to the next country to consider, Austria. Assessing Austria's culpability for World War I hinges a lot on one big question. What would have been a reasonable response of Austria to the assassination of Franz Ferdinand? You've got to remember just how big a deal the assassination was. Franz Ferdinand would very soon have become the emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. At the time, royalty was seen as more than people. They were the living embodiment of the state, the flag in flesh and blood. For people in Austria, the attack on their royalty was an attack on them personally. Combine that with how provocatively Serbia behaved after the assassination, and you can see why the Austrians were indignant with rage. Personally, I find it very difficult to decide where I think would have been a reasonable response of Austria. On one hand, to expect Austria to do nothing doesn't seem reasonable, but then neither is a full-on invasion and occupation. So what were the members of the Austrian government saying after the assassination? Well, they were almost entirely in favour of war with Serbia. The chief of staff of the military famously said, "If you have a poison adder at your heel, you stamp on its head, you don't wait for it to bite." The Minister of War declared, war is the only way out of the current predicament. The German ambassador in Vienna reported that almost everyone he spoke to wanted, in his words, a thorough settling of accounts with Serbia. The Austrian Foreign Minister Leopold Berchtold had in previous crises been relatively anti-war with Serbia. Now, after the assassination, that all changed and he viewed war as the only option. In his words, Austria's policy of patience has exhausted its plausibility. In part, the Austrians were worried about looking weak. The foreign minister wrote, "If Austria shows weakness, our neighbours to the south and east will become even more confident of our impotence and pursue their work of destruction with ever more determination." All that said, the Austrians did offer the Serbs the ultimatum, which may have, theoretically, offered a route to peace. However, you've got to remember that the ultimatum was designed by Austria to be rejected. The ultimatum was, to a large degree, just an attempt by Austria not to look like the aggressors. It's debatable how reasonable the terms of the ultimatum were. The most contentious part was Clause 5, which said that the Austrian police must be allowed onto Serbian soil to investigate the assassination. That certainly would have been difficult for any nation to accept. On the other hand, given that Serbia's investigation had been such a piss-take, it is kind of understandable that the Austrians would demand that. Overall then, the Austrians were very up for war with Serbia. However, the disaster of World War I is that it went so far beyond just a war between Austria and Serbia. That brings us to the question of how much blame does Austria have for escalating the war to the other powers, particularly Russia. Something that's interesting is just how little the Austrians considered the prospect of a wider European war. It was discussed on occasion, but it wasn't a big part of the decision-making. That might be because they had the backing of Germany and they were very confident of the German military. For Austria, Germany could either act as a deterrent or win the war for them. On the other hand, perhaps they were just so convinced that they were morally in the right and that the other countries would side with them. So can Austria be blamed for escalating the war? Well, the fact that Austria wasn't considering a big European war does imply at least that they weren't looking for one. On the other hand, maybe they could be criticised for not foreseeing what was going to happen. Maybe if they'd spent more time considering how things could escalate, they would have acted differently and war could have been prevented. Also worth mentioning is what Austria did 6 years earlier, its annexation of Bosnia. That caused an outcry from all the major European nations and the states in the Balkans. It was the annexation of Bosnia that was one of the biggest reasons that relations between Austria and Serbia were so bad. It also dramatically worsened relations between Austria and Russia. In fact, the annexation was such a big deal that it almost caused a big war to break out then. Serbia even mobilized its military. In the end, Russia and Serbia were forced to back down, and it appeared that Austria had got everything that it wanted. It had, however, contributed to dramatically ramping up tensions. While we're talking about Austria, I think it's worth mentioning the culpability of the man himself, Franz Ferdinand. This can be summed up with a simple question. Franz, darling, on the 28th of June, 1914, what on earth were you doing? It's impossible to overstate just how irresponsible the actions of Franz Ferdinand were that day. First, there was the fact that he was in Bosnia, which had been very controversially annexed only 6 years earlier. That was obviously a slap in the face for the Serbs. Then there was the fact that the parade happened on the 28th of June, which was and still is the date when Serbia celebrates the anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo. That is one of the most important dates in the Serbian calendar. That then was a second slap in the face for Serbia, and at a time when relations were extremely tense. Then there's the fact that he went out in an open-top car with the route published in advance. It's like they were trying to make it as easy as possible to attempt an assassination. Finally, if all that wasn't enough, Franz Ferdinand didn't evacuate after the first assassination attempt. That's right, the shooting of Franz Ferdinand was actually the second assassination attempt that day. The first attempt was with a bomb and failed to kill him. Now, if you're a royal visiting a controversial city and someone tries to assassinate you, you might think that the sensible thing to do would be to evacuate as fast as possible. Well, that's not what our boy Franz did. His reaction was to get back in the same open-top car and go and visit the people wounded by the bomb. The second and successful assassination attempt happened when he was on his way to the hospital. The sheer insanity of some of those decisions is just breathtaking. I mean, when you're such an important person in a country, you have an obligation not to act recklessly and put your life in danger. Your life isn't just your own, you have a responsibility to your nation and to its people. Franz Ferdinand did, of course, pay a heavy price for his mistake. Europe then also paid for his mistake, to the tune of tens of millions of lives. In the immediate aftermath of the assassination, Russia did various things to inflame the situation. First, it gave almost no sympathy to Austria and denied that Serbia had had anything to do with it. The Russian Foreign Office claimed that there was no Serbian involvement in the assassination. That was at a time when Austria had already produced evidence to the contrary. The Russians also lied about what was happening in Serbia in the aftermath of the assassination. The Russian ambassador in Serbia claimed that Austria was lying about Serbian celebrations and euphoria. According to him, the entire Serbian nation was moved to sympathy by the appalling murders at Sarajevo. That was complete bullshit. He also claimed that the underground networks, such as Black Hand, that were involved in the assassination didn't exist. There's a distasteful irony to that, given that there were members of the Russian state itself that were involved in Black Hand. Essentially, the Russians were accusing the Austrians of fabricating evidence. They were implying that Austria was taking advantage of the assassinations as a pretext to attack Serbia because they wanted to annex it. Essentially, according to Russia, Austria didn't have the right to do anything in response to the assassination. The Russians didn't even accept Austrian demands for an investigation in Serbia. The Austrian ambassador merely mentioned the possibility that Austria would demand that Serbia help with an investigation. The Russian foreign minister responded by warning him that that would make a very bad impression in Russia. In his words, Austria should drop the idea, lest they set foot upon a dangerous path. Something else that massively fanned the flames was a newspaper article published on the 13th of June. Its headline read, "We're ready, France must be ready too." It was widely reprinted in the French and German press. Most egregious was that the Russian war minister had been involved in publishing the article. The article painted a picture of a mighty Russian war machine ready to fall upon Germany. The Russian army would soon have 2.3 million men, more than Germany and Austria combined. Also, thanks to the rail network, mobilization times were plummeting. Of course, the Germans were extremely alarmed. In response to the article, the Kaiser wrote, at last the Russians have placed their cards on the table. Anyone in Germany who doesn't believe that Russia and France are working towards an imminent war with us belongs in the Doldorf asylum. The Chancellor wrote that previously only extremists believed that Russia wanted war. Now, he said, even calmer politicians were starting to believe it. That Russia didn't actually want war is clear from what was said when Austria sent its ultimatum to Serbia. The Russian foreign minister accused Austria of wanting war and said that it was setting Europe on fire. The Russian response to the Austrian ultimatum was a mixture of escalatory and de-escalatory. On the one hand, it requested that Austria extend the time limit of the ultimatum. It also told Serbia to withdraw its armed forces away from the border and avoid any unnecessary provocations. However, at the same time, it began stockpiling weapons and preparing for mobilization. The Russians were determined that they would take a quote-unquote firm approach. The Russian foreign minister stated that Russia would not remain inactive if the dignity and integrity of the Serb people, brothers in blood, were under threat. In the words of the Russian agriculture minister, Russia must take a firmer and more energetic attitude towards the unreasonable claims of the Central Powers. That attitude was in part because the Russian higher-ups believed that Russia had been conciliatory in previous crises. They viewed Russia's actions during the Balkan Wars and the Bosnian crisis as passive and that it got them nowhere. In their view, Russia now had to make a stand. If it didn't, Russia would lose all credibility to its allies. Other Russian actions also made it less likely that the Serbs would accept the Austrian demands. The Tsar urged them to quote-unquote fight like lions. The foreign minister told Serbia not to accept a British offer for intermediation. Something that dramatically affected Serbia's response to the ultimatum was Russia's decision to mobilize. Serbia had been considering accepting the ultimatum, but now that it knew of Russia's support, it was not going to. The decision by Russia to mobilize its military was by far the biggest contribution that it made to the escalation. Its significance can't be overstated. For us now, it's easy to think that just preparing one's military is a reasonable thing. To have the army ready doesn't necessarily mean that a country is going to attack. However, given military thinking at the time, mobilization was extremely provocative. At the time, it was generally believed that whichever nation was able to get their army to the battlefield first would win. In the Franco-Prussian War, for example, Prussia defeated France in large part by getting its army to the field first. That meant that when Russia mobilized, it was very difficult for Germany not to mobilize, out of fear that Russia would strike first and win a decisive victory. It was essentially a situation where the game theory led to incentives that made it harder to avoid war. Russia was the first nation to go into general mobilization. Even Austria-Hungary was only in a partial mobilization against Serbia at that point. The German government hadn't even declared a state of impending war, a level below mobilization. We can see just what a provocative step the mobilization was from what the Russians did after the war had broken out. In the records produced by the Russian government after the outbreak of war, they edited the date of the Austrian general mobilization. They changed the date so that it said that Austria had mobilized 3 days earlier, so as to make the Russian mobilization appear to be a reaction. A telegram from the Russian ambassador in Vienna was also edited. Initially it stated that the order of general mobilization was anticipated for the following day, July the 30th. That was changed to say that the order for general mobilization had already been signed. In truth, Austria went into general mobilization on the 1st of August, a full 2 days after Russia. The Russians knew that their decision to mobilize was a big step on the path to war and increased their overall culpability. Once that was done, the chances of avoiding a war were minimal. Another demonstration of just how big a deal the mobilization was is the response from Britain. On the night of the 31st of July, the German embassy informed the British that in response to the Russian mobilization, Germany had declared the state of imminent danger of war. If Russia didn't immediately reverse the mobilization, Germany would mobilize its own forces, which in turn would mean war. The British Prime Minister rushed to Buckingham Palace to wake up the King. The King was to send a telegram to the Russian Tsar to try to get him to stop the mobilization. Just think about what that means. The Germans, who were going to end up being the enemy of Britain in the war, contacted the British to say that the Russians were mobilizing and that that was a threat. For the British to urge the Russians to stop the mobilization was essentially an admission that the Germans were right and that the mobilization was indeed a huge escalation. The Russians didn't stop, even when the Germans requested they do. Germany stated that if Russia continued to mobilize, they would be forced to as well. Given that Germany wasn't mobilizing and it was asking Russia not to mobilize, that seems like a reasonable request to me. It was Russia's determination to mobilize that eventually caused war between Germany and Russia. Germany sent Russia an ultimatum demanding that it stop mobilizing. When Russia refused, Germany declared war. That then brings us on to the Germans, those beautiful, beautiful Germans. From the moment of Franz Ferdinand's assassination, the response of the German higher-ups was almost totally in favour of war between Austria and Serbia. It's easy to see that as pro-escalatory due to a desire for war. However, it can also be seen as an attempt to localise the conflict and contain it. If Austria attacked Serbia in the immediate aftermath of the assassination, it would be clear that their actions were in direct response and didn't have any ulterior motives. Nobody would have time to fret and get more and more anxious about what everyone else was up to. Also, immediately after the assassination, there was the most sympathy for Austria, so it would be harder for any other nation to come to Serbia's aid. There may well have been some merit to that. Austria sent its ultimatum to Serbia 4 weeks after the assassination. That allowed all the various nations of Europe to wind themselves up with anxiety. Most importantly, it allowed Russia to get worked up that Germany was driving everything because they wanted war. The Germans were confident that if Austria acted fast, the whole episode could be kept between Austria and Serbia, and they may well have been right. Many of the quotes from the Germans show that they did want the conflict to be contained and assumed that it would be. They thought it was unlikely that Russia would intervene. That said, they did acknowledge that there was the potential for a wider war. On the 12th of July, the German Foreign Secretary wrote, "We need to see to localizing the conflict between Austria and Serbia. Whether this is possible will depend on Russia. I have no wish for a preventative war, but if the fight offers itself, we dare not flinch." The Chancellor wrote on the 21st of July, "We urgently desire a localization of the conflict. An intervention by any other power will, in view of the divergent alliance commitments, lead to incalculable consequences." Kaiser Wilhelm II was in favour of immediate Austrian action against Serbia. When he read that his ambassador in Austria had been urging calm, he wrote, "Who authorised him to do so? This is utterly stupid. It's none of his business, since it is entirely Austria's affair to decide what she intends to do. It's high time a clean sweep was made of the Serbs." On another occasion, Wilhelm remarked that he expected serious action by Austria against Serbia, but that it might well bring about a serious European complication. On the whole, though, Wilhelm was assuming that Russia wouldn't intervene. That's for two main reasons. First, he believed that Tsar Nicholas would be very shocked by the assassination of a royal, and therefore unlikely to support Serbia. Speaking to a member of the Navy, he said he did not believe that there would be any further military complications, since the Russian Tsar would not place himself on the side of regicides. The second reason Wilhelm thought Russia wouldn't intervene is that he thought it wasn't ready for war and so would avoid it. For example, Wilhelm said to an ambassador, "For the moment, Russia gives no cause for anxiety. For the next 6 years, one need fear nothing from that quarter." Wilhelm's statements were at times less bellicose. When he saw the Serbian response to the Austrian ultimatum, he famously said that Serbia had tendered a capitulation of the most humiliating kind, and any reason for war has now been eliminated. Wilhelm even wanted the Austrians to be told that the case for war had now vanished, and that he himself was willing to mediate peace with Serbia. Unfortunately, his message was never delivered to the Austrians. Other members of the government didn't pass on the message. Farcically, once the Russians had gone into mobilization, the German Chancellor panicked and then delivered the message to the Austrians to try to restrain them. It was, of course, too late by that point. Overall, Germany's message to Austria was that it would back it whatever it chose to do, something that has come to be known as the blank check. Given that Austria and Germany were both in favour of a military response to Serbia, you do have to wonder what exactly they were hoping to achieve. I mean, war with Serbia was not going to bring back the Austrian heir from the dead. To try to occupy Serbia in the long term would almost certainly have been a disaster. I think they probably hoped that they could extract some humiliating concessions and re-establish their prestige. If they looked strong, it would deter potential future attacks. The Austrians even acknowledged amongst themselves their lack of any clear objective. At one point, an Austrian ambassador in Germany was asked what Austria planned to do after defeating Serbia, and not wanting to give away the fact that Austria didn't have a plan, he just made something up. He said that Serbia would be partitioned. That wasn't the official plan of Austria, and the ambassador had no authority to say that. As with Austria, we have the question of how much Germany was to blame for bringing Russia into the conflict. War between Austria and Serbia was one thing, but it was the escalation that really mattered. One very de-escalatory thing that the Germans did was not do anything militarily until very late in the crisis. On the 5th of July, Wilhelm was asked if he wanted the military to prepare for a European conflict, and he declined. Even once the Russians had mobilized, the Germans were debating whether to declare a state of imminent danger of war. That was the last stage before mobilization. Since mobilization was such a big deal, the fact that Germany didn't do it until very late in the day was very de-escalatory. Perhaps if Russia had had a similar reluctance to mobilize its military, the whole war would have been avoided. One thing that massively adds to the German culpability is the invasion of France through Belgium. After all, countries can mobilize their militaries, they can even declare war, but what really matters is when the soldiers actually start killing each other. I mean, look at North Korea and South Korea. They've technically been at war for decades, but with no actual military confrontations. The German invasion of France emphatically converted all of the mobilizations and declarations of war into real bullets being fired and real men being killed. After that, there was no backing down, no way that the conflict could be put into a deep freeze. The German invasion of France was the first major military offensive by a great power. Germany did that because it feared a two-front war against France and Russia at the same time. However, it did in effect mean that Germany ended up attacking a country that wasn't really showing signs of attacking it. Would France have stayed neutral if Germany had focused its attention only on Russia? There's no way of knowing, but I think it's a possibility. By going through Belgium, Germany brought Britain into the war. If Germany hadn't invaded Belgium, there's a good chance that Britain would have stayed out of the war, which likely would have shortened it and potentially reduced the death toll by millions. It's impossible to talk about Germany's culpability for World War I without mentioning the work of Fritz Fischer. He was a German historian who argued that Germany was primarily responsible for World War I. His work had a huge impact on the field and caused lots of controversy. In the words of another historian, Fischer instantly rendered obsolete every book published previously on the subject of responsibility of the First World War and the German aims in that war. Fischer argued that Germany had deliberately instigated World War I in an attempt to become a world power. He pointed to what's known as the September Programme, a German plan to annex large parts of Europe and Africa if it won. The work caused a lot of controversy in Germany, where the public believed that Germany wasn't so culpable for World War I. Since then, Fischer's work has been criticised, with historians pointing out that the September Programme plan was not produced until after the war began. Also, other powers made plans for what they would do if they won the war, and as you can imagine, those plans also included some juicy spoils of war. Overall, France played a relatively passive role throughout the July crisis, assuming that the assassination would at most lead to a local conflict. In fact, when the assassination happened, it wasn't even on the front pages in France. The French were absorbed by a pretty bonkers scandal where the wife of a former prime minister had assassinated a newspaper editor. She did that because the newspaper had published some love letters that she had sent. So essentially, while all the countries in the East were going to melt down over the assassination, the French were busy just being French, just doing their thing. The fact that France played such a passive role in the July crisis does mean that there aren't any real examples of it contributing to the escalation. That does, in my view, decrease its culpability somewhat. If France can be criticised for anything, it would be for not having done more to restrain Russia. France had been allies with Russia for decades and had the most influence over it. Even when Russia was coming out with the nonsense that Serbia wasn't involved in the assassination, or when it was denying that Austria had any right to respond, France remained fully committed to the alliance. France, like everyone else at the time, suspected that Serbia did have some involvement in the assassination. On July the 1st, Leon Deskos, the French ambassador in Serbia, reported that the Serbian military was involved in the assassination of Franz Ferdinand and that Serbia was in the wrong. That was ignored. The French president, like the Russians, basically thought that Austria didn't have the right to do anything in response to the assassination. That said, the French Prime Minister did tell the Russians not to do anything that would provoke Germany. Clearly that failed, as Russia was the first country to mobilise. Germany demanded that France do everything that it could to stop the Russian mobilisation. France may have been able to if it threatened to back out of the alliance with Russia. Essentially, Germany was demanding that France either declare neutrality in the upcoming war or it would be at war with Germany. Perhaps, given that the Russian mobilization was such a huge escalation, that was a reasonable request. Either way, France didn't do it. Germany then felt it had no choice but to attack France. Although France refused to declare neutrality, there is a possibility that it would have remained neutral if Germany hadn't attacked it. Would France have attacked Germany if Germany didn't attack France? Of course, we can never know for sure. Interestingly, French troops were actually pulled back from the German frontier as a demonstration of France's desire for peace. Britain, like France, was barely involved in the majority of the July crisis. Pretty much the whole way through it, it assumed that it wouldn't fight in any coming war. Even at the beginning of August, just before the war started, most British politicians were acting under the assumption that Britain wouldn't fight. What did eventually bring Britain into the war was the German invasion of Belgium, but even then, Britain might have stayed out. Britain had signed a treaty in 1839 guaranteeing Belgian independence, but the cabinet took the view that it was a collective obligation of all the signatories. Even Churchill, who was of course such a war hawk when it came to Hitler, was averse to defending Belgium. He commented, "I don't see why we should come in if they go only a little way into Belgium." The British press was also largely against war. The Manchester Guardian said that Britain shouldn't get involved and famously stated, "Manchester cares for Belgrade as little as Belgrade cares for Manchester." The Daily News was disgusted at the idea that British lives be lost for, in their words, Russian hegemony over the Slav world. Its editor, A.G. Gardner, wrote an article titled "Why We Must Not Fight," where he argued that there were no fundamental conflicts between Britain and Germany. He also argued that crushing Germany would only establish a Russian dictatorship over Europe and Asia. Given that Britain was so determined to stay out of the conflict, there aren't really any examples of it contributing to the escalation. In fact, the whole way through the crisis, Britain was trying to get the situation put to a conference in the hope that things could be talked out. However, Britain can potentially be criticised for some things. Like France, it could have done more to try to restrain Russia. The British knew that Serbia was involved in the assassination and did have some sympathy for Austria. The British Foreign Secretary acknowledged to the Austrian ambassador that Serbia was complicit and that some of the demands in Austria's ultimatum were justified. Germany actually tried to signal to Britain that if it remained neutral and was able to keep France neutral, Germany wouldn't declare war and the fighting would have stayed in the east. Britain didn't do anything to act on that proposal. Another potential criticism of Britain is that its ambiguity may have increased the chances of war. Nobody knew whether Britain would get involved or not. That allowed France and Russia to talk themselves into thinking that Britain would get involved, and Germany to talk itself into thinking that Britain wouldn't. If, from the outset, Britain had declared that it would get involved, that might have made the Germans more conciliatory. If, on the other hand, they had said from the beginning that they wouldn't get involved, perhaps France and Russia would have been. So, if those are the major actions of each nation, how can we go about trying to compare them? How can we try to judge each nation's culpability? One thing that makes it so difficult to evaluate how much blame each country deserves is that almost all of the actions are in response to other actions. That means you're constantly presented with the question of whether a particular response was reasonable. For example, how reasonable was it for Austria to declare war on Serbia after the assassination? How understandable or forgivable? I think it's extremely difficult to judge. How reasonable was it for Russia to give its full backing to Serbia? How reasonable was it for France to continue to back Russia even after it was mobilizing? How reasonable was it for Germany to give its total backing to Austria? I think it goes without saying that these questions are impossible to answer in any kind of objective way. It seems to me that well-informed, dispassionate people can come to very different conclusions. That said, I will give my viewpoint, although you should be advised that it's of very little value. I would say that Serbia, Austria, Russia and Germany all deserve a degree more blame than Britain and France. Serbia for the assassination of Franz Ferdinand and the provocations afterwards. Austria for being so determined to go to war with Serbia. Russia for mobilizing so early, and Germany for emphatically kicking the war off by invading France. I struggle to think of anything that Britain and France did that was escalatory to the same degree as those actions. Many historians prefer to reject the question of who was to blame for World War I, and it's easy to see why. It really was a joint effort, a joint catastrophe. It's difficult to know how to conclude a video about such a sad but also thought-provoking topic. As I was researching this video, I came across many quotes that in hindsight sound extremely disturbing and distasteful. Quotes from men either wanting the war or with a cavalier attitude towards it. Austrians that were determined to humiliate Serbia and win back their pride. Serbians gleeful at the prospect of bringing down the Austrian Empire. Germans keen on the idea of fighting Russia because they thought it might be their last chance. When reading these quotes with hindsight, I always felt the same feeling towards these men. Well, you got the war you wanted. Perhaps then the message of the First World War should be the old saying, be careful what you wish for, because you just might get it.